Hi, my name is Matt, or Cryptic if you prefer, and today I'm going to be breaking down my latest piece, the Project 77 ship, which was originally designed by Martin Deschambault over on ArtStation. This project was one that I started when I was just getting into live streaming 3D content. I wanted to start something big, and I wanted to go kind of as heavy as I possibly could have to ensure that I was both challenging myself and growing as an artist. All in all, this project took about 100 plus hours to complete, and that's from modeling all the way to rendering. If I were to add rendering time into that, we're probably looking at 200 plus hours, but I don't usually include rendering time just because it's not really part of the process, artistically anyway. So basically, I'm going to break down the scene, the way I built it and the way that I saw it, and hopefully this information kind of helps you guys and helps you understand the workflow that I used to build this. So what we'll do first, we'll look at the ship itself. So the ship itself was modeled in Maya. It went through quite a few revisions. Initially, my plan was to make it all one piece, and I realized pretty later on in the process that was just kind of a horrible idea, and it didn't really work. So with a shape like this, forcing all of this to be one piece would actually be a nightmare geometry-wise, and so I had to pick and choose where I was going to sacrifice what I was going to make a solid piece, what I would handle as a texture, and what I would have as a separate piece. So when it comes down to it, the ship itself is made up of multiple chunks. I tried to keep them as uniform as possible, just because I didn't want to have a ton of like floating pieces everywhere. But overall, I think when I finally made that decision, it was super important to getting this project to a finished state, because initially when I built this, I had built this in a very low poly mode, and I was starting to kind of model in some of these panel details. And while modeling in panel details is good and it can really help kind of sell the model and add a different dimension to it, it does create kind of a nightmare geometry-wise. So there was a lot of learning there that I had to do to make sure that my edge flow and everything was working properly and actually connecting and not just spiraling all over the place. And this model is by no means perfect. There are a lot of issues with the geometry, and this is the smoothed one, so this is the higher resolution model. The original is actually quite low poly when we're talking about a high poly model anyway. So looking at the ship, if I want to pull up the original concept art here, one of the things I wanted to do was continue to make sure that I was focusing on the shape of the ship. And there are some areas where I screwed this up. And looking at it, mine is kind of a more like sleeked version of this ship, whereas this one was kind of almost bulky. The original art is a beautiful piece, and I love it. And I do kind of wish I had focused a little bit more on widening the vehicle itself, but in the end, I am pretty happy with the way mine turned out, but I can still look at this and say, okay, so there were some issues there that I created. Not so much necessarily as accidents, but just really not paying attention to the actual shaping on the concept art. I'll use the engines back here as a prime example, just because this was A, an area that we only have reference for the front of it or the top of it, and B, I thinned it out because as I was building this, because I don't have a view of what the back of the ship looks like, the only thing I could assume that would be back there would be some sort of loading bay or some sort of entry bay to get into the cockpit. Even though when I originally modeled this, the cockpit was actually a hatch that opened up on the front of the ship. So the design changed a little bit throughout the entire process, but you can see with the ship, or what I did is I built this bay in the back. And so the bay is very simple. There's really no detail to it. I handled a lot of the details with just normal maps and height maps, just because I wanted it to look decent from a distance, but I really didn't care about going into it. And that was something I kind of had to fight with because I wasn't sure if I wanted to build out everything in there. I think eventually I may go back and I may rebuild this, at least the back portion. At least the back portion, because I do feel like this was the kind of the final end of this model, and I got really tired of it, and I just decided I didn't want to work on it anymore. But a lot of this detail, none of this really existed, so I had to kind of formulate in my mind what I wanted to do, and I wanted to do something that was a little bit less done. I wanted to create this ion ring pattern, so that's why we have this pattern back here, where I have these individual rings that would technically, in theory, I guess, create the thrust that actually pushes this thing through space, as well as building like a little afterburner bay in here that would control pitch and roll and all that stuff. Another feature that I wanted to model in was I wanted these to be able to kind of flip open. I didn't end up kind of completing that concept or that thought, but originally the plan was that these would kind of open up and close as if the ship were moving through space and using it to brake. Really, I wanted to kind of approach this thinking about like how this would actually function in reality if this was an actual ship. And so from the concept art looking at it, we could kind of get a good glimpse of like the shape of the engine, but not so much the function of it. So I wanted to take things and create like flaps that would have independent controls on how the ship would brake and stop in both like in atmosphere flight and space flight. Another one of the things that wasn't really present was the landing gear. So landing gear, I kind of simplified. I just wanted something that was going to fill the space and look decent. So the rear is just a couple of pistons that are controlling some sleds. And then the front, since I wanted it to be a little bit more of a visual representation of like actual landing gear that would fold up and come out, I wanted it to be kind of an arm that would collapse up, fold up, and then go back into the body. So this was kind of the process that I went through just building this. One of the bigger issues I had was with the body. The body shape doesn't make a lot of sense, and there's a lot of different areas where I ran into problems with edge flow. At one point, I built the entire body, and I was trying to integrate the fins to the engine bay as an actual piece in the body, and that actually caused me so much pain that I ended up just completely scrapping that idea and rebuilding it. But the body went through so many revisions. I built probably 6 or 7 different versions of the body, as well as when I got to the final version, I built the entire thing out, and then my topology was so bad that I actually went back and completely retopologized it and then rebuilt it from the ground up just to make sure I had a good piece of geo to work with. And the final worked out pretty well. Again, this is the smooth model, so you can't really tell like how the actual edge flow really works well, but overall I did my best to remove any end guns, anything like that. And I think with everything I did on this one, I am very proud of where the body ended up because of the amount of time and work and effort I put into actually making sure that this edge flow made sense and it was something that could be worked with. Modeling the ship took anywhere 40 hours, so it was a large portion of the entire process. I spent most of my time in modeling and texturing. I really didn't spend a lot of time in rendering or editing, and that's just because I wanted to focus on these 2 main aspects of this project. I didn't really have a plan. Initially, what I was going to do was I was going to take the original concept art and I was going to build this whole cityscape, and then I realized kind of later in the project that that wasn't going to be the smartest idea. And it's not that I don't love what Martin did here, it's just because I wanted to make sure I could do an enclosed space and then play with interior lighting, because exterior lighting and interior lighting are 2 total different beasts. And so when you're learning, it's a lot easier to replicate outdoor lighting than it is to replicate indoor lighting, at least in what I've found throughout the years. So after I finished modeling this, we pulled it into Substance Painter. When I brought this into Substance Painter, I immediately started working on adding details that I didn't model in. So the paneling details, all of these are actually just height maps that are just textured in. They're nothing crazy, they're nothing super difficult, they're just lines that I painted through. I wanted to make sure that I was giving the illusion of paneling without having so much paneling on the ship, because I wanted this to be high poly, but I didn't want it to be so high poly that it was like unusable, it was unopenable. And this model throughout its stages actually became quite unusable, and so this entire project for me was a huge learning experience on how to kind of optimize and refine my scenes. So looking at this, right, this is the kind of the first rendition that I textured through, because I wasn't sure what direction I was going. My wife had mentioned that it would be cool to like change the color to more of a copper than the original orange that I had. And the copper really did kind of sell the original coloring. And it's something that's kind of, you kind of have to observe looking at concept art, and it's not something I necessarily picked up on. And so you have to observe the way like color shifts in concept art. And so with this, you can tell there's like, it's not just a flat orange. So there is some shimmer, some shine there. And so I feel like the material itself replicated that shimmer and shine really well. However, things just weren't like working very well. It was looking really mucky. It was very busy, and there was a lot of issues with it. I really loved the idea of having missing tiles, and it's something I actually didn't carry over into the final project, and I'll kind of explain why. But this was kind of the first rendition of it. This was like the first pass of texturing, and I spent a good amount of time on this, but this is where I started to kind of develop the ideas that I had originally with like the ion rings and everything like that. This was the 5th iteration. I could go through all of the iterations, but it's honestly like the main thing that changed was just some of the original design on the paneling on the body, as well as the tiles that make up the heat shield of the ship. So working with Rogelio Ogun in the Control G Academy, we kind of decided that the original tile texture was a little bit too crazy. This was also a really different stage, because if you saw the original tile texture, you noticed how blurry it was. The reason it was blurry is because this was something that I didn't really understand at the time, but you can actually take your single objects and split them across multiple UV tiles. I was already using UDIMs, but I did not know that you could take a single object, that is the ship body for instance, and split it across multiple tiles. So whereas I had the ship's body on one single UV tile, I actually took it, cut it up, and threw it over 5 other tiles to give myself as much texture density as possible. And I think the result really kind of speaks for itself. I got a really nice clean look. Rogelio recommended a really nice texture or a really nice material on the Substance Painter sort of marketplace that I ended up going with. This is a really beautiful tile material that kind of has like a sci-fi look to it. You can't tell because I'm not in the 4K variant, but you can kind of tell. There are some lines that go through each one of these gaps between the tiles to kind of give it like an in-place like holder almost look to them. And overall, it's just a really beautiful material that I ended up using for it. This is also the process where I started looking at the ship and adding some of the line details, so the kind of the decals that you would have on this. And I wanted to push this a little bit further just because I felt like it was only in small spaces. So you had a little bit here on this edge, you had the 44, and then this. So what I ended up doing, because I did model this slightly incorrectly, I took the 44 and I nixed it, and then I created new different types of panel decals. So these decals now you can see are these white painted spaces, and so what I did was I added them over, and then I blurred the texture underneath to make it look like it was some sort of overlay. You're still seeing the texture popping through, but it was an overlay. This is something I really like to try to do when I'm texturing, is to make sure I'm looking at real world reference and understanding how certain things work. So when you put a vinyl or a paint over a bumpy surface, you're going to see that bumpy surface shine through, but it's going to be slightly distorted because you've covered it. So one of the things I wanted to make sure I was doing was showing that, and I think it shows through really well, and I really like the way the panel vinyls kind of popped out. This is also where I started to kind of refine the coloring on the ship itself. I added a lot of dirt and a lot of grime, and so I started to pull back a little bit on that because there were some issues where some of the grime was just coming through and it just wasn't working out really well. Another person I worked with, Gordy, had pointed out that some of the dust was really kind of popping through, and I just didn't like that. So there were a lot of changes and renditions that this all went under, and you can still see some of the remnants of the dust. I did add more to it, but I tried to refine it better. This is also where I decided to finish the underbody. I decided to have the tiles kind of go towards this point where these two little inlets are. The body is something I probably could have worked on a lot longer to refine better, but I did want to just kind of get this project done and completed with. So it's kind of where I spent less of my time. I wanted it finished. Like, I wanted it to look decent if you looked at it, but I also didn't want to pay too much attention on it because it wasn't going to be a super big focal point on the final renders. But you can see with this tile material, it really did kind of help sell that like design, that the tiles themselves were actual individual pieces, and some of them have different hue shifts, and it's really nice to see the way the light plays off of them. Overall, this was kind of the full workflow through Substance Painter. There was a lot of renditions, there was a lot of trial and error. This was probably my 4th asset working inside of Substance Painter, so by now I'm starting to get more comfortable with some of the tools inside of it, and kind of pushing the ideas on what I was using before. One of the biggest things I started using on this project are what are called anchor points, and anchor points are super useful because what I did with the anchor points was I would create the texture using a colored fill layer, and so I would use that colored fill layer with that hex pattern, and then I would anchor point that to a height channel somewhere else where I could individually control everything. And that gave me the ability to kind of really refine and change the way the tiles themselves were interacting with light, as well as interacting with like the shape of the ship. Overall, it was a really interesting experience working with this in Substance Painter. This is also where I started to run into my biggest problems. The ship itself, all of the UV tiles on this ship are in 4K. And the biggest issue I started running into with this is I was running out of VRAM on my GPU. So I have to load this thing in 2K to show it to you because it just doesn't run in 4K. It's very laggy, it's very glitchy, it's very unusable. So when I started to kind of run into issues here, this is where I started to kind of figure out like, okay, maybe there are ways to either refine this or push this I'm pushing this too far, Really, it comes down to a mix of I pushed it a little too far, as well as my hardware is just not up to spec for it. So things to change in the future, but things I'm not super worried about right now. So back in Maya, we're looking at the scene again. So I had everything loaded in. I got my UDIM tiles loaded in, but I didn't have a scene. And so for me, I didn't want, with the amount of time I spent on this project, I did not want to just have it floating in black. To me, it seemed like it was going to be a disservice to the ship itself and the work that I put into it. So I decided to kit bash a hangar together. But I am kind of awful, and so I decided to model all of the pieces that I was going to kit bash the hangar together with, because there are certain things I will use other assets for that I've downloaded from the internet, but there are also just situations where I would much rather build something myself and be proud that I built it myself, even though it maybe isn't perfect. And so that's where the hangar came in. So if I turn the hangar back on, the hangar itself, this is what it looks like on the outside. It's very simple. There's stuff sticking through it all over the place. It looks terrible. But on the inside, this is our model. This is what we built. So I built the hangar. All of these pieces are pretty simple pieces. They're really not that dense or anything like that. They don't have a lot of detail to them. I think this is the one piece I spent the most time modeling. And there's issues all over the place, right? Like, so these were just created on curves. They're just sweep meshes that I just extruded, and they look pretty terrible. When you put a texture on them, they really don't look that bad, but geometry-wise, they look awful. You can see they're stretching everywhere. They're just terrible. But again, everything is very simple. I didn't want this to be overcomplicated because I knew I could push it in textures. And unfortunately, I pushed it a little too hard. So when you're building environments, one of the best things to think about is where is your focus going to be? Because if you're going to be focusing kind of in the center of this, everything doesn't need to be super high detail. I put a lot of detail into the scene assets themselves. And so if I pull up the image here, right, if we look at the final render, there's a lot built into this. So if we scroll all the way up here, you can see that there's vents in these huge pipes. There's caution material, and like, yeah, from a distance, it does really sell it. And these are better. But what I didn't need to do was I didn't need to do 4K textures on these railings that actually have little indents and little bolts and everything on them. Like, there was just too much added to them, and it really bogged down my scene. So one of the biggest things that I learned from this was 4K assets or 4K texture assets on everything. Not a good idea. So things that are small, things that are you know, going to be distanced away or very not visible, it doesn't really matter. So I kind of shot myself in the foot with this scene because I put way too much detail into the materials, and then I output them in 4K, which was just kind of a mistake because I took a scene that was pretty renderable and I made it almost unrenderable on my hardware. But a lot of this was just kind of unplanned. I did add a bunch of stuff. So if I pull up my pure reference scene, I can show you kind of like where this is where I got a lot of the ideas for what I was doing. One of the things I wanted to really replicate was this like kind of overhanging catwalk idea, as well as the lighting. So really, I just kind of pulled a couple generic like sci-fi hangar looking pieces of art, and then I just kind of tried to mirror that. You can see I actually almost directly copied this, even though I wasn't even thinking about that at the time. But really, I just grabbed a few pieces of reference and decided what I was going to build in. There were some issues that we found with working with Regalio, and there are issues that I still will probably fix in the future because I'm still working with him on this project. But one of the main goals with this was to create kind of a realistic environment. I wanted to sell that this was an environment that you could walk around in, and it existed. And so my approach to it was less of an artistic approach for the environment and more of a physical-based approach. And so looking at it, what we'll do is we'll turn my lights on. So looking at my lighting, I kind of tried to think of where real lighting points would be. So I knew for a fact that with these, I wanted these lights right here. I wanted these to be little hanger lights or little launch pad lights, whatever you want to call them. The other thing I wanted to do was I wanted to sell that these things actually did something, so I threw little area lights in them just to make sure that they kind of had that glow, and you can see that in the render here. So it just gives off a nice little light, and that's all that is. And these were just like fuel distribution systems, and that's why you can see the pipe running off. Everything I built in here had some sort of purpose. I didn't want it to just be there to be there. So that was one of the big things that I wanted to make sure that I was selling. The other thing is the lighting on the bays. When you look at the model, or when you look at the final scene, the lighting on the bays, I wanted to be that fluorescent lighting that you would have in like a warehouse or a hangar. So I wanted it to be that cold, just kind of like harsh light. And I think that kind of came through really well, especially in the background. You can really see it in the background. And these weren't physical lights. These were, again, just panel lights that were set up in Maya. They were just little area lights. And I know I said these were area lights earlier. These are point lights, not area lights. I'm sorry. But these are just area lights that are set up to mimic fluorescent lighting. And the same thing with the lights in here. So the approach is really simple, right? They're just panel lights. There is one larger panel light in the scene, and this larger panel light gives the scene its like base lighting. So it kind of brightens everything up, but then I take that light and so I will kind of work it down. So initially I have my bright lights, and I think I have a render for that. Let me see. And you can see kind of what this looked like. So with the larger light, this just provides that very basic kind of just environment lighting. I just wanted to have something that gave me an idea to what I was working with, and then I would kind of start working my way out from there. So that large light stayed in the scene, but as I worked with the scene, it got less and less powerful. I think when I ended this thing was sitting at like what? Yeah, it's sitting at like an exposure of 18. Whereas if we look at these lights in the back here or on the thing, these guys are sitting at 16. They're just in a closed space. So they're much closer. The light's actually turned on. The diffuse in the camera is turned on so you can see the light. It feels a lot brighter than it is because it's kind of in a different setup. When you're talking about lighting, where you position your lighting is going to heavily affect the way it affects your environment. So because this is like a big, overwhelming light that's just passing down a bunch of light, it falls off a lot faster. So this is where I started to kind of just play with this. Initially, I had it set to something like 20 or 30 just so I could brighten the scene up and see what I was working with. And then I just slowly backed that off as I was going. The other thing that was really important with this light was the color. And you can see it really, really clear here. It's got like a bluish tint to it. I wanted to still sell that idea of like a space-like hangar. And so in space, we have a lot of blue lighting. We have a lot of darker lighting that isn't necessarily like man-made light. So I wanted to continue that idea throughout this scene, which is why we kind of break it up. So it's broken up with this man-made lighting, right? We have our fluorescent bulbs, which break that up. And then we have our incandescent bulbs. These spotlights were meant to be kind of like overhanging lights. And so this was another one of the conversations that we had where we talked about having one center spotlight. And while I love the idea of having one center spotlight, it's more of an artistic approach than it would be a real physical-based approach. Because when you're in a hangar, when you're in a warehouse, the warehouses don't have large, giant, singular spotlights for areas. They have multiple, so they're just strewn across the ceiling. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to sell that same idea. So I did include more over the ship because I wanted to highlight portions of the ship, and you can kind of see where they worked. So you can see kind of the outline and the fall off of these spotlights on the ship. And I think it really kind of gives it a really nice broken up design across the ship's hull. So the concept there was to have these hanging spotlights, because you would have, with a hangar this size, you would have probably hundreds of them. So these spotlights are pretty simple. They're just set with 19 exposure and they just shine down, and then there's some decay added to them. I wanted this to be as clean and physically based as possible. I didn't want to really hyper focus on any one point in this entire set. I wanted the ship to be the focal point, obviously, because that's where the time was spent. But I wanted the lighting to sell that it was actually a place. It was there. It was a physical place that you could be. And so that was the goal with the lighting. So when people ask, like, what are your lighting setups? Like, they're really not complex. They're very simple. And I try to go for simple because real life is simple. When you're talking about trying to replicate, say, outdoor light pouring into a house or something like that, that's a very different setup than something like this. This is very simplified because all I'm doing is replicating what we would have set up in real life. If we built a ship like this, this is how that hangar would be set up. We would have these lights, we would have everything built out that way. I think it's really important to sell that because in the end, I want the art to look real. Like, I want it to look as real based as possible. And I think, unfortunately, with this model, or with this project, it did end up looking more like a really fancy video game cinematic. And that's something I want to figure out how to either retool later on or just kind of work with. Because as an artist, my goal is to create realistic looking things. I want to strive for the stuff that we used to see in things like the original Transformers movies, or Prometheus is a really good example. The ship in Prometheus, like, that is a very realistic looking, physically based ship. And so that's the goal here. I think what did that is the fact that I built my own environment. Because I'm not really an environment artist. That's not my goal. I threw it together. I think it worked really well, and I think the final result really did sell it, and I think it's beautiful. I'm very proud of it. But I definitely see issues with it. And this is something that I will always sell to artists, is that it's okay to see issues with your work, but it's also okay to call your work done when you're ready to call it done. This project for me was something that I never wanted to finish because I was stressed that it was not going to be good enough. I was very stressed it was not going to be good enough. So I worked really hard to make sure that I could comfortably say this is done. I still can't say it's done because I am still working with Rogelio in the Control G Academy to kind of refine this. And I think that's going to come to more of an artistic refinement than it is like a physically based art refinement, which is totally fine. It's good to learn both. But I'm very proud of where this ended up. And I'm happy to say that I'm done hyper-focusing on it. Because at some point as artists, we do need to stop and we do need to say, this is it. That's it's done. It's good. This is in my portfolio now. This is on my Instagram. This is on everything now. So this project, in that sense, is done. There is still stuff to learn, and that's okay. I'm going to continue working on that. But overall, I think it's really important to go back and look at your projects and establish what you did right, what you did wrong. And it's really important for artists to be able to do that. And so looking at this, I know what I did wrong. And unfortunately, some of the stuff I did wrong is actually harder to fix than it is to just kind of keep pushing through it. Like the 4K materials, just to reassign everything is going to be a nightmare. But the reality is that when it came down to this project and I finally had this final image, right? Like this came out and I looked at it and I said, this is it. It's good. That comes down to me saying, I did what I set out to do. 6 months ago, when I started this project, I did not remember 90% of the things I learned in college. I did not remember 90% of the things I did throughout the years to kind of keep the animation and modeling bone alive. I did not remember a lot of it, as well as I did not know a lot of it. There were so many lessons in this, I can't even list them out. There were so many things I learned. And this project truly made me a better artist, just like BD1 did, just like anything before it did. And I try to do that with every single one of my projects, is to make myself a better artist. And so when I look at this, I see the imperfections, but that's okay, because I know the next project is going to be even better. If I can leave you all with anything, it is to take your time, but also be honest with yourself. Be ready to say, this is done. This is good. I'm proud of this. And that's what matters, because your imperfect work will get better over the years. And it's okay to make bad art. And, I don't consider this bad art, but I do see the issues where I know I could have done more. And it came down to just me wanting to be done with this and wanting to say, we're good. And this whole project has been a work over 7 months. It's been 7 months of second guessing myself. It's been 7 months of changing things. And it's been 7 months of also ignoring it. I put this project away for 2 months because I did not want to touch it anymore. I was so burned out on focusing so heavily on the topology and making sure it was perfect that I just decided I can't focus on this anymore. I need to do some other stuff, and then I'll come back to this. And I came back to it and I pushed through, and this is the result we got. And quite honestly, I can't say to myself that I would have done it any differently. I'm open to learning more about it and learning more of what I could have done. But when it comes to saying that I finished this, I'm happy with this, and I'm thrilled at where it ended up. So that's just a little piece of advice I'd like to offer you guys as artists. And you know, the concept of keeping things simple. Like, you don't have to do crazy configurations for your lighting. Like I said, this is very basic. There's really nothing crazy here. All I did was think about, well, would there be a light there? And yeah, well, yeah, there would be a light there, so I put a light there. Some of this stuff I think gets overthought and it gets over-focused on. And when you're doing more artistic style things, it's understandable. There's a lot that you need to focus on there, and the advice changes constantly, right? The advice changes for characters. The advice changes for props. Everything is different. But when it comes to this stuff, I just try to keep it simple, and I try to make something that looks cool, right? Like, my goal is to make stuff that looks cool too, and stuff that I'm proud of. And that's what happened with this project. And I'm happy to say it's done. So with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope this was kind of a good deep dive into the process that I took building this. If you guys want more in-depth information, let me know in the comments. I would be glad to do more like videos based on just like the individual processes, but only if that's something you guys want. So if that's something you're looking for, leave me a comment, let me know. If not, and you made it to this part in the video, thank you so much for watching. Please make sure you liked and followed, because there will be more content coming soon. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.